So I want to introduce you all to Charles. He's my youngest child. And he was the funniest and most popular kid in school. Yet the funniest and most popular kid in school suffered from depression, became addicted to heroin in the last 6 months of his life, and died by suicide. Now, this picture was taken about a year before things got really, really bad. But this was a proud mama moment. He was on the homecoming court that year, and my older son actually won, and I'm escorting the older son. But it wasn't long after this that Charles started to have a real cavalier attitude about life. And I didn't realize until later that that's a symptom of depression. But it scared me. And then his drug use started to escalate. At this point, he wasn't addicted, but I was in fear for his life. So we had to take a drastic step. And we had my child kidnapped out of his bed and taken to this wilderness program, which, as you can tell from the picture, he absolutely loved. So I had exhausted all local resources here in Richmond, Virginia. And there was no continuity of care, and that was a problem. So I was left to be the navigator of a very complex system. And one thing that really bothers me now is I kept asking people for a diagnosis. And what people would do was prescribe things and do things, but it was kind of like they just threw it against the wall to see if it would stick. There is something called a psychological evaluation. That should have been done for my son, and it wasn't done until wilderness. So, and I got a really good one for wilderness, but for 35 grand, you would expect that, right? So it came back that he had anxiety and depression, ADHD combined type, and he also was diagnosed with cannabis dependence, which I didn't even know was a diagnosis, and that meant that he was self-medicating. So from here, Charles ended up going to therapeutic boarding school, and then he ultimately graduated from Wasatch Academy in Utah. So the trouble was that I brought my son back to the state, ranked 48th for treating childhood major depression. We have how many states? 50. 48, not that great. And that's why you see me up here today, telling my story and doing over 95 presentations since he died, because I want that number to change, and we can do better than this. So about June 5th, 2015, my husband and I are sitting in the restaurant at Rio Tuscan Grill. And my husband gets a call on his phone from the police, and we agree to meet them in the parking lot. So in the back of a police car, and my husband in the front, we get the worst news of our lives, that our son has been found dead in an apartment on Monument Avenue. And my husband says, you know, we're wailing, we're reacting, the bottom has dropped out of our world. And my husband says, well, how did he die? And for some reason, in my mind, I'm thinking, what a crazy question. You know, we had just found out he was addicted to heroin maybe a month before. So we just, you know, we hadn't navigated, and I'm like, well, of course he died of overdose. And the policeman says he died by hanging. My husband is reacting, he's banging on the glove box, and I'm just sitting there. I just can't absorb that information. I'm not even breathing. And when I do breathe, what comes out of my mouth is the worst guttural wail you've ever heard in your life. So my world was completely turned upside down. And here's the thing. So when he was alive and struggling with mental illness and struggling with addiction, nobody wanted to talk about it. I would bring my son up, I would try to talk about what we were going through, and nobody wanted to hear it. So the lack of emotional support was probably one of the most difficult things to endure. So afterwards, when I needed it the most, and after the memorial service, I would run into people, and they would not even mention his name. And when I did, they would cut me off mid-sentence. And I realize that a lot of that has to do with not knowing what to say to somebody who's lost a child. But a lot of that has to do with the implied shame, silence, and stigma of mental illness, addiction, and suicide. And we had all three going on. And another thing that people weren't telling us was the relationship between addiction, mental illness, and suicide. And somebody should have mentioned it at some point after spending $75,000. You would think somebody would have mentioned that it was a high risk for suicide. I did not erase my son from my family tree. So what I did next is I wrote an article for Richmond Times-Dispatch, and it became the #1 article for 2016. And it didn't become the #1 article because I was a fantastic writer. It became the #1 article because other people were reading their story in mine. So shortly after that, I started this blog, Emotionally Naked, and I started talking about addiction, mental illness, suicide, grief, all the things that we don't want to talk about. And I talked about it openly, and like the title says, emotionally naked. And today, as Sandra said, over 250,000 people in the last 18 months have been to that site. And the interesting thing is, because over 100,000 people have shared those posts, I get messages from people that say, I didn't kill myself last night because of what I read on the blog. And now I rank on Google. And they find the posts from Google. And you can, some of them are in the messages on the site, other ones they hit the contact button and they'll send me that message. How can I quit doing what I'm doing? I just can't stop. So now we're going to discuss how does somebody go from bubbly, fun, cute, adorable, most popular kid in school to addicted to heroin and suicide. First of all, we have to recognize that suicide is the #2 leading cause of death for 15 to 35-year-olds. It is the #1 cause of death for 11 to 15-year-old girls. And it's gotten a promotion in the last 2 years because we have swept mental illness under the rug and because of the opiate epidemic. And not just people who are addicted, but the kids who have parents who are addicted. And we're not getting treatment for those parents. So here's one of the first problems. We're a crisis-oriented state. And what that means is we wait until it is the absolute worst before we do anything about it. And that's when it costs us the most. 6 times what it would cost for early intervention. So we wait until it's millions and billions costing our state. And we're not investing in those early intervention strategies that can turn a life around. Because when you have an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old, you have a far more compliant patient than you do with a 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old. Here's another issue, is the access to care. I had the means, I had the insurance, and I struggled with access to care for my child. When he came home, he was in the gap years, so he was 19 years old. Not many psychiatrists would see him. So access to care continues to be a really huge problem. And because we've swept it under the rug, now we have this epidemic, and we can't get in. People can't get beds when they're asking for them. Over 100,000 kids in Virginia have a parent who's incarcerated. Think a minute about what that does to a child, not only having the trauma of a parent incarcerated. So what we're doing, 50% of the people in jail are in there on drug charges. Some of them on real simple marijuana possession. You take somebody that is near poverty to begin with, and you put that parent in jail, you don't have a breadwinner anymore. That person often loses his or her job. Once they get out, they struggle to find their identity again. They struggle to find their job. They're behind on child support, on car payments. and they spiral downward. So we're putting people in jail for something that we really don't, and they need rehabilitation is what they need. But we're not putting the money there. We're putting money in making more prisons. So for the last 30 years, we've had the war on drugs. After the first 10 years, we looked to see how well it was doing, and it was doing terrible. Oh, but no, we had to do it for another 20 years. So that's the same thing as me hitting that head against the wall and expecting a different result. We need to start putting that money to our children, to their families, because these are families, and when we break up this family unit, we do not have a positive way for kids to thrive. Now we have 5,000 in the foster care system. The trouble is we have 700 that are about to age out. That means they've got nobody in the world when they turn 19. 32% of their parents are incarcerated, or they are suffering from substance use disorder and were removed from the home. So that right there, if we could get people the help they need when they need it, then we could keep these families together and fewer kids would be in the foster care system. We also treat mental illness and substance use disorder like two different silos. So one of the things we would run into is that I would take my son for drug abuse treatment. Now, he wasn't addicted when he was 16 years old, but he was abusing drugs and alcohol. And I had a real difficult time getting him to be treated for his depression while he was in that treatment. So I had to wait. So it would finish, and then I had to make the appointment and wait. And in that time, they tend to go back to abusing those substances. So there's multiple opportunities for them to relapse before they get their mental health treatment. We do not mandate that teachers get suicide training or mental illness training or drug abuse training. Now, in Chesterfield County, they are doing the signs of suicide, and several other counties are also introducing that into the curriculum. But think about it. Who sees our kids more than anybody? The teachers. And they know the things about these kids. And they can refer them to counselors, school counselors, and get these kids the help they need. But they can't do that without training and recognizing the signs of suicide. Like me, I didn't know what the signs of suicide were. And if I had, I could have saved my child's life. Another issue is that we are not a Medicaid expansion state. So we got this big old pile of money out there that we've said, oh no, we can't take it. And it's this big political thing. And let me tell you who the victims are. They're 8-year-olds who want to fling themselves off a balcony and can't get their evaluation paid for. That's who the victim is here. And Beacon Tree does pay for evaluation. So that 8-year-old that wanted to fling himself off the balcony, we picked up the $600 copay because the family couldn't afford it. Because I don't want a family that is actively trying to get care for their child to be denied that care. Because that's the point in which we can get help for that child and we can change the trajectory of their life. So I've talked a lot about all this scary stuff and all these gaps. And I want to introduce a program that we've put in a grant for. We've partnered with VCU Institute of Drug and Alcohol Studies. And this program shows amazing promise. It shows up to 80% reduction in drug and alcohol use in schools at 3-year follow-up. It's been done for over 5 years in multiple other countries. It's never been done here. And we've got that grant. We have to resubmit it on November 4th. But I'm impatient because I know this works. I've met Dr. Conrad from Canada, and she's coming to train us in January. So we're hoping to do it at least at one school. And then I'll be running around begging for money because we're more than willing to put money in more prisons, but when it comes to early intervention, I have to beg. But it's for the kids, and I will keep begging, and I will never give up until the day I die. It identifies 4 personality traits that have shown a predisposition to addiction, and that would be sensation-seeking, impulsiveness, anxiety sensitivity, and hopelessness. And what this program does is it basically, you have 2 90-minute workshops focused on a particular trait that child might have, which would be impulsiveness, say for example. 2 90-minute sessions to give this child valuable life skills training. That's all it takes. Life skills training. But no, we decide that maybe our kids need trigonometry, which fewer than 2% ever use. We also have a recovery school in Richmond. And the trouble with that is we don't have any state support, so tuition is $16,000 a year per student. Families just can't afford it. So it's accredited, it's at St. Joseph Villa, it's called McShin Academy, and we can't get it filled up because nobody can afford it. Thank you so much today for listening to my story. 7 years ago, I couldn't dynamite a door down to talk about mental illness. And even 2 years ago, I couldn't get into a school to speak. I couldn't get in anywhere. But you guys welcomed me in here tonight to listen to a message, and I just want to tell you how grateful and how thankful I am for that. Thank you.